life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. My life was turned upside down the day I was rushed into emergency surgery, but instead of being surrounded by family and love, I felt abandoned. This is the story of how I nearly died during surgery, but my parents were too busy focusing on my adopted sister's wedding. Growing up, my sister, Sarah, and I were close, or at least that's what I used to believe. Sarah was adopted when she was 5, and I was 3 at the time. Our parents had always been upfront about her adoption, but they treated her like a princess. I, on the other hand, felt like the shadow that barely existed in their eyes. Sure, they provided for me, but it was clear where their priorities lay. From the moment Sarah came into our family, everything seemed to revolve around her. She was the center of attention at every family gathering, every birthday, and every life event, and I just got used to it. By the time we were adults, the differences between how our parents treated us had become a part of life. Sarah was beautiful, charismatic, and outgoing, while I preferred quieter moments and often felt overlooked. I had learned to find solace in my own company and in a few close friends. It wasn't until Sarah's engagement that the disparity between us became impossible to ignore. Sarah had met Jack, her fiancé, a year before, and their engagement was like a fairy tale. Our parents were ecstatic. They threw lavish parties, hosted endless dinners, and involved themselves in every intricate detail of the wedding planning. For months, it felt like every conversation I had with them circled back to Sarah's wedding. One night, about 2 weeks before Sarah's big day, I began to feel excruciating pain in my abdomen. At first, I thought it might be something minor, but the pain worsened until I couldn't stand straight. My roommate rushed me to the emergency room. By the time I arrived at the hospital, I was delirious with pain. The doctors quickly discovered that I had a ruptured appendix, and I needed emergency surgery. Everything after that was a blur. I remember being wheeled into the operating room and feeling terrified, but what frightened me more than the surgery was that I didn't have anyone there with me. I was alone. My parents weren't answering their phones, and neither was Sarah. I knew they were caught up in last-minute wedding preparations, but I thought they'd at least be concerned for their daughter, who was in a critical situation. After what felt like an eternity, I woke up in the recovery room, groggy and in pain, but alive. I glanced at my phone, hoping to see missed calls or messages from my family. There were none. Instead, there were endless texts in the family group chat about the wedding floral arrangements, guest lists, dress fittings, not a single mention of my surgery. It was as if I didn't even exist. My closest friend, Emma, was the one who stayed by my side, holding my hand as I drifted in and out of sleep. But my parents, they didn't come to the hospital. Not that day, not the next. They didn't even ask how I was. When I was finally discharged, I went home with a heavy heart. Part of me hoped that maybe they didn't know how serious it was. Maybe they were simply too distracted. But when I called to tell them, their response was heartbreaking. "Oh, sweetheart, we're so glad you're okay," my mom said, but there was no urgency or concern in her voice. "You'll be fine, right? We're just so busy with Sarah's wedding preparations. You understand, don't you?" Understand? How could I understand that my life had been at risk, and they hadn't even bothered to come see me? The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. I tried to recover physically, while grappling with the emotional scars that were harder to heal. My body ached, but the pain of realizing how little I seemed to matter to my parents cut deeper. I kept replaying the events over and over in my head. Was I overreacting? Was it selfish of me to expect them to be there for me when they had so much on their plate with Sarah's wedding? But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about the wedding. This was about years of neglect, years of being the second choice, the afterthought. It was about the realization that no matter how close I had come to death, Sarah's happiness would always come first in their eyes. The wedding day came, and despite everything, I decided to go. My heart was heavy as I watched Sarah walk down the aisle, radiant in her wedding dress, surrounded by love and admiration. Everyone was beaming, including my parents, who looked at her as if she was the only thing that mattered in the world. I sat her day in the back, feeling invisible, just like I always had. But this time, something inside me shifted. As the vows were exchanged and the applause erupted, I realized that I couldn't keep living in the shadows. I couldn't keep waiting for my parents to see me, to value me, to love me the way they loved Sarah. That night, after the reception, I packed my bags and left. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I just knew that I deserved more than what I had been given, and if my parents couldn't see that, then it was time for me to start seeing it for myself. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. I knew that, but as I walked away from the life that had always made me feel like I was on the sidelines, I felt a sense of liberation. For the first time, I was prioritizing myself, and that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. As I healed from my surgery, both physically and emotionally, I began to rebuild my life, one step at a time. I learned that family isn't always defined by blood, but by the people who stand by your side when you need them the most. And while my parents may have chosen Sarah over and over again, I was finally choosing myself. Walking away from my parents and Sarah's wedding was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made, but it also felt like the first time in years that I was choosing to prioritize my own well-being. It wasn't just the physical recovery from the surgery that I needed, it was the emotional healing part of me that had been broken for so long by years of being sidelined in favor of my sister. I had always let it slide, convincing myself that it didn't matter, I didn't need the same attention or love. But when I almost lost my life and they didn't even show up, something inside me snapped. In the weeks after I left, I moved in with Emma, my best friend who had been my rock through the entire ordeal. She understood what I was going through more than anyone else. Having seen the way my family treated me for years, living with her was a breath of fresh air. It was a new chapter, a chance to redefine my life on my own terms. One afternoon, as we sat on her balcony sipping tea, Emma asked me something I hadn't really considered before. Have you thought about what you want to do next? Not just with your family, but with your life. I stared out at the horizon, the question echoing in my mind. For so long, I had lived in the shadow of my sister and my parents' expectations. I had never really thought about what I wanted for myself. The realization was both daunting and liberating. For the first time, I had the freedom to make my own choices without worrying about how they might disappoint my parents or be compared to Sarah's achievements. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I want to start living for me. The first step in that process was cutting off communication with my parents, at least temporarily. It wasn't out of spite, but out of necessity. I needed to heal, and I couldn't do that if I kept exposing myself to their indifference. I didn't tell them where I was living or leave any messages after I left the wedding. There were a few missed calls from my mom and texts that seemed concerned on the surface, but they quickly fizzled out. Soon, they were back to being consumed with Sarah's new life as a newlywed. I wondered if they even noticed I was gone. Surprisingly, Sarah reached out to me a week after her honeymoon. I wasn't expecting it. A simple text, "Hey, are you okay? I heard about the surgery. Sorry I couldn't be there. Let's catch up." I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to scream at her for being so oblivious, for not realizing how hurt I was. But another part of me, the part that had always craved validation, wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she didn't understand how much her wedding had overshadowed everything else in our family, including my near-death experience. We met for coffee a few days later. She was as radiant as ever, glowing with the excitement of her new marriage. As we exchanged pleasantries, I felt the familiar pang of envy, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about competing with her. It was about finding peace for myself. "I didn't know how serious things were with you," Sarah said, stirring her coffee. Her brow furrowed. "I feel terrible about it. The wedding was it was so overwhelming, and I was caught up in everything. I hope you're okay." I nodded, sipping my own drink to buy time. "I am recovering, physically, at least, but I needed some space." She looked up at me, her eyes full of concern, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the sister I used to be close to when we were younger. But then her phone buzzed, and she was distracted again, glancing at the screen and muttering something about Jack needing her. It reminded me why I had distanced myself in the first place. "Sarah," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "I almost died, and no one came. Not you, not mom or dad. I don't want to make you feel guilty, but I need you to understand how that felt. She frowned, the phone in her hand, her eyes widening. I didn't realize it was that bad. I thought you were okay after the surgery. They didn't tell me. They didn't care enough to tell you. I finished for her. And that's the problem. I've been invisible to them, and maybe to you, for a long time. I'm not saying this to hurt you, but I need to put myself first for once. I need to figure out who I am without constantly trying to fit into this family dynamic, where I don't matter. Sarah's expression softened. I'm sorry, really. I don't know how things got so messed up, but I understand. Take the time you need, just don't shut me out completely. I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't sure how much of a relationship we could rebuild. We were both living in different worlds, and I wasn't sure if our paths would ever truly align again. After our meeting, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had confronted the issue, and while it wasn't fully resolved, it was a step toward healing. More importantly, I had made the decision to focus on my own happiness. In the months that followed, I started to rediscover passions I had long buried. I took up painting again, something I had loved as a teenager but had abandoned when life became too hectic. I signed up for a creative writing class, finding solace in the stories I crafted, stories that allowed me to process the pain of my family dynamic. I even started a part-time job at a local gallery, a space that nurtured my creativity and gave me the sense of belonging I had always craved. Slowly but surely, I was rebuilding my life this time, on my own terms. It wasn't easy. There were days when the loneliness crept in, when I missed the comfort of having a family, even if they weren't perfect, but I reminded myself that I wasn't truly alone. I had friends like Emma, and more importantly, I had myself. Months passed, and as the distance between my family and me grew, so did my sense of peace. I never anticipated how empowering it would be to live life without constantly seeking their approval, but I discovered a strength in myself that I didn't know existed. My days were filled with purpose and joy, whether it was through painting at the gallery, writing stories that helped me process my emotions, or simply spending time with Emma, who had become my biggest support system. One evening, as I sat her day in my small apartment working on a painting, a notification buzzed on my phone. It was an email from my mom. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of whether I was ready to hear what she had to say. Her absence during one of the most vulnerable moments of my life still stung, and I wasn't sure if I could handle another reminder of that pain. But curiosity won out, and I opened the email. It was brief, not at all what I had expected. Hi, sweetheart. I've been thinking a lot about you lately. I know we've been distant, and I regret not being there for you when you needed us. Things got so busy with Sarah's wedding that I lost sight of what truly mattered. I hope you can forgive me. Your father and I would love to see you and talk. Please let us know when you're ready. Love, Mom. I stared at the words, unsure of how to feel. Part of me wanted to respond right away, to grab onto the chance of reconciliation, but another part of me, the part that had spent months working on myself, was hesitant. Was this just another temporary moment of guilt from my parents, or was it a genuine acknowledgement of how they had hurt me? I took a deep breath and closed the email, deciding to give myself time. I had learned that rushing back into relationships, especially those as complicated as family, wasn't the answer. I needed to continue healing, and that meant setting boundaries, even if they were difficult. As the days turned into weeks, I received a few more messages from my parents, each one asking when I would visit, when we could talk. Eventually, I responded, agreeing to meet them for dinner at a neutral location. I wasn't ready to go back to the family home, where so many memories of feeling invisible still lingered, but I was open to having a conversation. The night of the dinner, I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. As I walked into the restaurant, I spotted my parents sitting at a table, looking older and more tired than I remembered. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, realizing that time had passed not just for me but for them as well. My mom stood up as soon as she saw me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. "Oh, honey," she said, wrapping me in a hug that I wasn't sure I was ready for, but I allowed it, letting her hold me for a moment before pulling away. We sat her day down, and the conversation began awkwardly. My dad cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We've missed you," he said simply, looking down at his hands. "We didn't realize how badly we'd hurt you until it was too late." I appreciated the honesty, but I also knew that words weren't enough to fix what had been broken. "I've missed you too," I replied, my voice steady, "but I need you to understand that this isn't just about the wedding or the surgery. It's about years of feeling like I didn't matter as much." My mum's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "I know, we didn't mean to make you feel that way. I guess we got so caught up in everything with Sarah that we didn't realize how it was affecting you." There was a silence that followed, heavy but necessary. It was the kind of silence that allowed the truth to sink in. I had always been afraid to confront my parents, afraid that they wouldn't understand or that they would dismiss my feelings. But sitting here, I realized that I didn't need their validation anymore. I wasn't looking for an apology to heal. I had already started healing on my own. "I'm not angry anymore," I told them, and it was the truth. "But I need things to change if we're going to have a relationship. I need to feel like I matter too, not just as an afterthought." My dad nodded, and for the first time, he looked genuinely remorseful. "We'll do better," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We love you, and we're sorry if we ever made you feel otherwise." It wasn't the perfect resolution, but it was a start. After dinner, I left feeling lighter. There was still a long way to go in mending my relationship with my parents, but I knew I had taken control of my own story. I wasn't the same person who had sat all day in the shadows, waiting for scraps of attention. I was building a life where I was the priority, and that life was beautiful. In the months that followed, my relationship with my family began to improve, slowly but surely. We weren't perfect, and there were still moments where I felt the old insecurities creeping in, but I had learned how to voice my feelings and, more importantly, how to prioritize myself without guilt. Sarah and I also found a new dynamic, one where we weren't constantly in competition for our parents' attention. She began to understand my need for space, and over time, we reconnected as sisters, not as rivals. She even came to one of my art shows, surprising me with her genuine interest in my work. It was small steps like these that helped rebuild the bond between us. As for me, I continued to grow. My art flourished, and I found a sense of purpose in helping others through creative expression. I even started volunteering at a local youth center, teaching art to kids who didn't have the same support I was lucky enough to find in my adult years. It was my way of giving back, of ensuring that no one else ever felt invisible like I had. Looking back now, I realized that almost dying during surgery wasn't just a brush with physical death. It was a wake-up call for my soul. It forced me to confront the life I had been living and the relationships that were holding me back. And while it was painful, it also gave me the chance to be reborn into the person I was always meant to be, someone who mattered, someone who chose herself first.